The morning Theodora Holt discovered what her uncle had done, she was standing in the servants' entrance of her own house. Not as a guest, not as the daughter of the late Earl of Dunvale, as a housemaid applicant, her hair tucked under a plain linen cap, her hands folded in front of an apron that belonged to someone else. The housekeeper, Mrs. Price, looked her over once, twice, then wrote something in her ledger without looking up again. "You have references from the Harmon household in Somerset," Thea said. 3 years. The name was real, the reference was not. She had spent 2 weeks arranging it with the only person in Somerset who still owed her father a favor. "We don't get many girls from the country," Mrs. Price said. "No, ma'am. The Duke keeps precise hours, meals at 7, 1, and 8. He doesn't like noise in the East Corridor before 9 in the morning. He doesn't receive visitors without appointment, and he doesn't repeat himself." She set down her pen. "Can you follow instruction?" "I can," Thea said. Mrs. Price studied her for one more moment. Something moved behind the woman's eyes. Not suspicion, exactly, but the particular alertness of someone who had spent decades watching people come through that same door. "You start Monday," she said at last. Thea walked back out through the servants' entrance, down the side lane, and around the corner before she let herself stop moving. She pressed her back against the garden wall and looked up at the sky. October. The London air smelled of coal and the river. Dunvale House, her father's house, the house where she had learned to read in the library on the 2nd floor, where her mother had kept roses on the breakfast table every spring, where the staircase still had a loose board on the 4th step that creaked if you stepped left instead of right. Now it belonged to the Duke of Ashbourne, and Thea was going to work in it. She had 3 weeks before her uncle's solicitors finalized the remaining estate papers. 3 weeks to find what her father had promised was there, a sealed letter, a second will, something that proved what had been done to her was not legal. She didn't know exactly what it was. She only knew her father had told her, 3 days before he died, that she would find what she needed inside the house. In the library, behind the painting of the river, she had not been allowed back inside since the transfer. Now she had a different way in. The Duke of Ashbourne's name was Calloway, Lawrence Calloway, the 4th Duke, though he held the title by a thread that Thea still did not entirely understand. He had purchased Dunvale House 6 months ago through her uncle's arrangement. A sale her father had never agreed to, a transaction that should not have been possible while the estate was still in contested probate. She knew his name from the papers. She knew his face from one occasion only. The solicitor's office, 8 months ago, when she had sat across a long table from men who informed her in careful measured language that her father's debts had made the inheritance untenable, that her uncle, as the appointed trustee, had made the necessary decisions, that Miss Holt would of course receive a settlement adequate to her situation. The Duke had been in that room. She had not known who he was then. He had sat to the left of the solicitors, said nothing, and watched the proceedings with an expression that revealed exactly nothing. She had remembered his eyes afterward. Not their color, the quality of them, the way they did not move from her face for the entire meeting. She had not thought of him as anything other than an obstacle until the day she stood in front of Dunvale House and calculated what it would take to get inside. Her first week, she learned the house again. It was strange, relearning a place you already knew. The rooms were the same, the dimensions, the light at certain hours, the way the kitchen smelled when the range was going. But things had been moved. Her mother's writing desk was gone from the morning room. The portrait of her grandfather had been replaced by a landscape she didn't recognize. In the dining room, the curtains were heavier, the table extended with a leaf she'd never seen before. She cleaned and she listened. She carried trays and she watched. The Duke of Ashbourne was rarely at home before noon. He left early and returned late, and when he was in the house, he was in his study on the ground floor. The room that had been her father's sitting room, the one with the view of the garden. He ate alone at the long table. He did not make requests of the staff beyond the standard ones. He did not raise his voice. The other maids treated him the way you treat a fixed feature of a landscape. He was there. He had requirements. You met them and moved on. Thea found she could not do that. She watched him the way she had watched the solicitors in that office, carefully, cataloging, looking for the thing she hadn't been told. On Thursday of her first week, she was carrying a coal scuttle past the study door when it opened. She stepped back. He stepped out. For 1 second they were closer than they should have been, and she saw his face from 18 inches rather than across a room. He stopped. "I haven't seen you before," he said. Not unkind, simply direct. "I started Monday, Your Grace. I'm sorry, I'll move." "You don't need to move." He looked at her for a moment. "What's your name?" "Britton, Your Grace, her mother's maiden name." "Safe enough." He inclined his head slightly and walked on toward the entrance hall. Thea waited until she heard his footsteps reach the front door. Then she let out a slow breath and kept on walking. He had looked at her the same way he had in the solicitor's office, like he was cataloging something, like he was very, very careful about what he saw. She needed to be more careful than he was. The library was on the second floor, east side, the same room it had always been, though the furniture had been rearranged so the reading chairs faced the window instead of the fireplace. The shelves were intact. Most of her father's books were still there. She recognized the spines. Whoever had inventoried the estate either hadn't cared about the books or hadn't gotten to them yet. She was assigned to clean the library on Friday mornings. The first Friday she moved slowly. She dusted every shelf. She noted which books had been disturbed, which ones carried someone else's marks, pencil lines, bent corners. The Duke read history. He read law. He read nothing her father would have touched. The painting her father had mentioned was still there, a river scene, wide and gray-green, attributed to no one she recognized. It hung between 2 windows on the north wall, lower than the other paintings. She didn't touch it the first week. She was not ready. In the evenings, the staff ate together in the kitchen. She learned their names. Jennings, who had driven for the previous owner before the Duke retained him. Cook, who went by no other name and seemed to prefer it that way. Agnes, 14 and very new and desperately eager to be liked. There was also Mr. Seward, the Duke's personal secretary, a thin man of about 40, with a habit of appearing in doorways without making noise. He frightened Agnes. He simply made Thea watchful. She noticed things about Mr. Seward. He checked the mail before the Duke received it. He kept a second ledger separate from the household accounts. He was in the study sometimes when the Duke was out, but the study was supposed to be locked when the Duke was out. She noticed these things and said nothing about them. One evening, Agnes asked Thea where she was from. "Somerset," Thea said. "What part?" "Near Taunton." Agnes had a cousin near Taunton. Was Thea familiar with the village of Merrywell? Thea said she wasn't. Agnes was disappointed but moved on to asking whether Thea thought the housekeeper liked them. Thea said she thought Mrs. Price was fair-minded and moved on. Later that night, she lay in her narrow bed in the servants' attic and thought about the painting and about the 14 days she had left. On the second Friday, she went to the painting. The library was empty. The Duke had left early. Mr. Seward, she had verified, was at a meeting in the city. Mrs. Price was occupied with the laundry inventory. Thea set down her duster. She walked to the north wall. She stood in front of the river painting and looked at it for a moment. Just a moment, because she was aware of every second. She lifted it from the wall. Behind it was a narrow gap between the plaster and the wainscoting, maybe 4 inches wide, maybe 6. Empty. She stood there with the painting in her hands. She made herself breathe. She felt along the edge of the gap with her fingers. Plaster, dust, nothing. She checked the back of the painting itself. Nothing taped, nothing slipped behind the canvas. She rehung the painting. She stood in the middle of the library for a long moment and looked at the shelves. Her father had said, "Behind the painting of the river." He had been specific. He had not been a man who was imprecise with language. He had been a man who was, in the last days of his life, frightened and running out of time, but not imprecise. Either something had already been removed from that gap, or she was looking in the wrong place. She looked at the painting again. The river in it was wide, gray-green. The bank on the left was shadowed. On the right, faintly, there was a building, low, old, more ruin than structure. She had lived in this house for 20 years, and she had never looked closely at that painting. She moved to the shelves and began to look at the books by their groupings. Her father had organized by subject, then by date of acquisition, a system she had helped him build when she was 12. The law section was third shelf from the top, left side. She ran her finger along the spines. Standard texts, titles she recognized. And then, about a third of the way in, a book that was the same height and binding as the others, but titled with only initials, E.H.D. Her father's initials were Edmund Harold Holt. She pulled it out. It was not a book, it was a box made to look like one. Inside was a sealed envelope, and on the front of it, in her father's handwriting, was her name, Theodora. Her hands were shaking. She stood very still until they stopped. She put the box under her apron and kept cleaning. She read the letter that night, in her room with the door bolted and a single candle. It was 3 pages. Her father's handwriting, cramped and slightly uneven near the end. He had written it when he was already ill. The first page explained what he had done and why. He had not, in fact, left the estate in debt. The debts her uncle had presented to the solicitors were partially fabricated. The original will had contained a clause that made Thea the primary heir regardless of any debt. A clause her uncle had struck from the recorded copy. Her father had kept the original. It was not in the house. He had given it to a woman named Frances Dray, a solicitor's widow in Chiswick, who had been a friend of her mother's. She had it. She was waiting. The second page was about the Duke of Ashbourne. "I don't know how he came to buy the house," her father had written. "Your uncle approached him." Calloway did not ask many questions, which I believe he now regrets. He is not a bad man. He is a man who acted quickly on incomplete information, and I believe, if you can make him understand what was done, he will not stand against you. He has reasons of his own to want your uncle's conduct examined. The third page was short. "I'm sorry, Thea. I should have been more careful. I should have protected you sooner. I know what I'm asking you to do is unreasonable. Go to Frances first. Then go to Calloway. In that order, and please don't do anything reckless in the meantime." She set the letter down. She thought about the painting, about the way she had stood in front of it, trying not to run, about the book-shaped box and the cool weight of the envelope in her hands. Then she thought about the letter's second-to-last line, "He is not a bad man." She thought about the way the Duke had looked at her in the doorway, that cataloging expression, like he already knew something he wasn't saying. She blew out the candle. She was going to Chiswick tomorrow. Then she would figure out the rest. Frances Dray was a compact woman of 60 with gray hair and an expression that suggested she had spent decades watching people underestimate her. She lived in a narrow house behind a tidy garden. When Thea knocked, Mrs. Dray opened the door within 10 seconds, as if she had been expecting her. "You look exactly like your mother," the woman said. "Come inside." The document was real. Thea read it herself, slowly, while Mrs. Dray made tea she didn't drink. The clause was there, plain English, plain legal language, signed and witnessed by 2 men whose names she didn't recognize but who she now needed to find. "What do I do with this?" she asked. "You take it to a solicitor who isn't in your uncle's pocket," Mrs. Dray said. and then you take it to whoever can make use of it fastest. The Duke. The older woman looked at her steadily. Your father thought so. I confess I don't know the man. Neither do I, Thea said. Not really. She folded the document carefully and put it in her coat. She thanked Mrs. Dray. She walked back to the street and stood for a moment in the October air. Her father had said, "Go to Calloway." In that order. She had the document. She had done the first thing. Now she had to tell the Duke of Ashbourne that she had been living in his house under a false name, had deceived his housekeeper and his staff, and had been searching his library. In order to ask him to help her take the house back. She started walking. She told him that evening. She asked Mrs. Price to inform the Duke that Britain would like a word, on a personal matter, at his earliest convenience. She expected to wait. She did not expect him to send word down within 10 minutes that she should come to the study. She knocked. He said, "Come in." She entered. The study had been her father's sitting room. The furniture was different now, heavier, darker, but the view through the window was the same. The garden in the fading October light, the oak tree at the far end that her father had planted when she was born. She had not looked at that tree since she arrived. She made herself not look at it now. The Duke was standing behind the desk. He did not sit. He watched her come in and stop on the other side of the desk, and she was aware again of that particular quality of his attention. Still. Complete. "Miss Britton," he said. "My name isn't Britton," Thea said. "It's Holt, Theodora Holt. My father was Edmund Holt, the previous Earl of Dunvale. This was his house before it was yours." She watched his face. He went very still, not surprised exactly, or not only surprised. Something else was happening behind his expression. "How long?" he said carefully. "Have you been in this house?" 11 days. And before that, I grew up here. I lived here until 8 months ago when your solicitors and my uncle's solicitors sat me down in a room and told me the estate was insolvent. A long silence. "Sit down," he said. "I'd rather stand." He looked at her. "All right." He came around the desk and stood a few feet away. Not aggressive. Just not willing to have a desk between them, apparently. "What do you want?" "My father left a document, a second will with a protective clause my uncle had removed from the recorded copy. I have it now." She reached inside her coat and placed it on the desk. "I'm not accusing you of participating in what my uncle did. My father didn't believe you knew, but you are in possession of a property that was fraudulently transferred, and I need to know whether you're willing to acknowledge that." He didn't look at the document. He looked at her. "You came into my house as a housemaid," he said, "under a false name. You searched the library. Yes, you could have come to the door." "No," she said, "I couldn't. I tried to reach you twice through your solicitors. My letters were not returned." Something crossed his face, quick and tightly controlled, but it was there. "Which solicitors?" he said. "Seward and Ames." Another silence. Longer this time. He turned and picked up the document from the desk. He read it. She watched the lines of his face. He was a careful reader. She could see him moving through the language clause by clause, the same way she had done. When he finished, he set it down and was quiet for a moment. "I was told the estate was in full order," he said, "that the sale was clean, that the family had been provided for. My uncle told you that. His solicitors confirmed it, Mr. Seward?" He looked at her sharply. "You know Seward. He's your secretary. He was also one of the 2 solicitors who handled my uncle's side of the transaction." She paused. "He keeps a second ledger in your study. He checks your mail before you see it." The Duke was very still for a long time. Then he said, "Sit down, Miss Holt." And this time it wasn't a suggestion. It was something else. A man who had just understood that he needed to think carefully, and who needed her to stay in the room while he did it. She sat. It was not a short conversation. He asked questions the way her father had described men he trusted, methodically, without repetition, not letting any answer stand, until he'd examined it from at least 2 angles. She answered everything. She showed him the letter from her father. She told him about Mrs. Dray in Chiswick. She told him about the book-shaped box and the gap behind the painting that turned out to be empty. At some point, Mrs. Price appeared at the door with a lamp and an expression of restrained alarm. The Duke told her they would not need dinner in the dining room. She retreated. "Your uncle," the Duke said at some point in the second hour. "What do you think he intended?" "I think he intended to sell the house before I could contest the will. I think he calculated that a young woman alone, without resources, without her father, wouldn't be able to stop it." She paused. "He almost calculated correctly. And Seward. I don't know how far back it goes. I only know what I've observed in 11 days. She looked at him steadily. "You know more about Seward than I do. You hired him." Something shifted in the Duke's face. It was the first time she had seen anything like discomfort there. Not quite guilt, but the particular expression of a man who has realized he has been careless in a place he should have been careful. "Yes," he said. "I did." They sat in silence for a moment. "I should tell you," he said, "that I have my own reasons for wanting your uncle's conduct examined. The property he sold me, there are documents missing. Things that should have transferred with the title and didn't. I've had my own solicitors looking into it, quietly, for 2 months. He paused. "I didn't know about you. Thea thought about her father's letter. He has reasons of his own." "My father knew," she said. "He looked at her. He told you, in the letter. He said you weren't a bad man. He said you acted on incomplete information and that you'd want the situation corrected." The Duke was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "He wrote that about me. He did. He didn't know me. He knew your family's history. He said he'd watched how you handled a different matter some years ago. Something about a land dispute in Northumberland." Something changed in his face, very briefly, very carefully, but it changed. "That was 12 years ago," he remembered. Another silence. The lamp on the table had burned lower. Outside, London had gone quiet the way it only went quiet after midnight. "You can stay," the Duke said. "In the house. You don't have to go back to the servants' attic." She looked at him. "The staff. I'll handle the staff." He said it simply, without drama. "You're not a housemaid, Miss Holt. I won't have you sleeping in the attic of your own house." She felt something move inside her. She didn't name it. It was too early and the situation was too complicated. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me yet," he said. "We have a great deal of work to do." The next several weeks were precisely that. Work. The Duke brought in a different firm of solicitors. Men who had no connection to her uncle, who looked at the document from Mrs. Dray and spent a long time asking their own questions. Thea sat in on every meeting. She had spent 20 years watching her father navigate these rooms. She knew when a solicitor was stalling, and when he was being direct, she knew which questions mattered and which were decorative. The Duke watched her in these meetings with that same careful attention. She watched him in return. He was not what she had assumed from a distance. He was quieter than she had expected. He was precise in a way that was not coldness. It was more like a man who had decided at some point that imprecision cost too much. He prepared for every meeting as thoroughly as she did. He did not perform certainty he didn't have. Mr. Seward was removed from his position in the 3rd week. The ledger Thea had noticed went with him to the solicitors. She did not ask how the Duke had handled the conversation, and he did not offer to tell her. But the morning after it happened, he looked like a man who had not slept well. She found him in the library that morning, standing in front of the river painting. "It's a scene from Northumberland," she said. "I looked it up. The building on the right, it's a priory." He turned. He hadn't heard her come in. "How long have you known that?" "Since last week. I was curious what my father had chosen to hide behind." She paused. "He liked that painting. He bought it before I was born." The Duke looked at it for another moment. "It's a good painting," he said. I thought so. He turned. They were about 10 feet apart, the morning light coming in through the east windows, the library smelling the way it always had, dust and leather, and something faintly sweet she had never been able to name. She had spent whole afternoons in this room as a child. She had read her first novel here. She had sat in the corner chair the night before her mother's funeral and stayed until dawn. "Miss Holt," the Duke said, "may I ask you something that isn't about the estate? You may ask. When you came here, as Briton the first week, how did you decide what to look for first?" She considered the question. "I wasn't looking for anything specific the first week. I was relearning the house. Relearning. It had changed. Things had been moved. I needed to understand what was different before I could find what was the same." He was quiet for a moment. "That's very methodical for someone in a desperate situation. My father taught me to think before I acted." She paused. "I don't always succeed, but I try." Something moved at the corner of his mouth. The faintest thing, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. "He sounds like he was a careful man," the Duke said. He was. He was also very kind. Those things are harder to combine than people think. A silence settled between them. Not uncomfortable, just full. "I didn't know his name," the Duke said. "When I bought this house, it was all handled at a distance. I knew there was a previous owner. I didn't ask enough about what had happened to his family." She looked at him. There was something in the way he said it that wasn't an excuse. It was a man accounting for something. "You didn't know," she said. "I should have asked." "Yes," she said, "you should have." He looked at her steadily. Most people, she had found, couldn't tolerate being agreed with when they were criticizing themselves. They wanted to be contradicted, absolved. He just nodded once, like he'd expected it. The case took 6 weeks to reach a point where the solicitors said it was solid. Her uncle had retained his own lawyers by then. There were letters back and forth that Thea read and set aside without showing to the Duke, because some of them were ugly in ways she didn't want to share. One evening in late November, she came downstairs to find the Duke in the entrance hall with his coat still on, reading one of her uncle's letters that had been delivered to the house. She didn't know how it had ended up in his hands. He looked up when she came down the stairs. "You don't have to read those," she said. "I know," he said. "I wanted to." She came down the last few steps and stopped. The hall was cold. The fire hadn't been lit yet. "What does it say?" He folded it and held it out to her. She took it. She read it. It said, among other things, that Thea had always been unstable, that Edmund Holt had doted on her in ways that had left her with an inflated sense of her own position, and that any document she produced should be treated with corresponding skepticism. She folded it back along his crease lines and handed it to him. "He's frightened," she said. Her voice was even. She had practiced it. "Yes," the Duke said, "he should be." He paused. "Are you all right?" She thought about the question. She wanted to give him an honest answer. "Not entirely," she said, "but better than I was 6 weeks ago." He looked at her for a moment. Then he said, very simply, "You should know that whatever the outcome of the legal proceedings, the house is yours. I've had my solicitors begin the reversal paperwork. It doesn't depend on your uncle's cooperation." She had been prepared in a distant theoretical way for many things. She had not been prepared for that. The simple, direct fact of it. "That will cost you," she said. "Yes. The purchase price, the carrying costs, the Miss Holt." He said it quietly, but with enough weight that she stopped. "I bought this house without asking enough questions. I am correcting that. It isn't a favor." She stood in the cold entrance hall and looked at him. Her father had written, "He is not a bad man." She understood now what he had meant. "Lawrence," she said, for the first time. She watched him absorb it, the use of his name without title. He was very still for a moment. Then, "Theodora." Neither of them moved. The hall was quiet. Somewhere in the back of the house, Agnes was saying something to Cook that made Cook laugh. a low, warm sound that traveled through the old walls the way sound always had in this house. "I'd like to call you that," Thea said. "If you're willing." "I am," he said. December came with the particular London cold that seeped under doors and through the old window frames and settled into the stone of the walls. Thea learned, for the first time, what it was like to be cold in her own house. She had always associated it with warmth. She was recalibrating. There were meals together now, not formal, just the two of them at the end of the long table, which had been shortened again at Thea's request, so that they were not 12 chairs apart. Lawrence read at breakfast. Thea read at breakfast. They had discovered, independently, that they read some of the same things, and occasionally one of them would read a passage aloud and the other would respond to it. And this was, she realized one morning, the pleasantest part of her day. She found herself noticing things she hadn't meant to notice, the way he tilted his head slightly when he was thinking hard about something, the fact that he never began a sentence he hadn't finished in his head first. The small, precise kindnesses. The lamp moved to the correct side of her chair without discussion. Agnes given a Sunday afternoon off without being asked. She noticed these things and did not mention them. One evening she found a letter on her desk. It was from her uncle's solicitors, a formal offer of partial settlement, an acknowledgment worded so carefully as to say almost nothing, while conceding almost everything. She brought it to Lawrence's study. He read it. "They're backing down," he said. "Partially. It's enough to proceed." He set it down. "Do you want to accept it?" She had thought about this. She had thought about it for days, in the way you think about something you know you have to decide. "I want the house," she said. "I want the will enforced, and my father's estate properly settled. I don't need anything beyond that." She paused. "I'm not doing this to ruin him." Lawrence looked at her for a moment. "Even after what he did?" "Even then." She paused. "My father spent years being angry about things he couldn't change. I watched it cost him. I don't want to carry that." He was quiet for a long moment, something in his face that she was still learning to read. It was the expression he wore when something had gotten through whatever he kept in front of himself. "All right," he said. "We'll respond in the morning." She turned to go. She was at the doorway when he said her name, Theodora. She turned. He was still behind the desk. The lamplight was low. His expression was, for once, not careful. "I'd like—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know what the appropriate thing is to say, given the circumstances, given how this began." She waited. "I know it began badly," he said. "I know that I was part of why you had to do what you did. Come in through the back door and pretend to be someone you weren't. I know that." He paused. "And I know that some part of what has happened between us, whatever that is, has happened inside a situation that wasn't fair to you. So I want to ask." He stopped again. And Lawrence Calloway, the Duke of Ashbourne, who never began a sentence he hadn't already finished in his head, looked at her with something entirely unguarded on his face. "When this is over, when it's settled and the house is yours and there's no longer anything complicated between us, would you be willing to start over? As just two people?" The study was quiet. Outside, December rain tapped at the window. She thought about 11 days as Britain the housemaid, about the book-shaped box and the sealed letter and her father's careful handwriting, about Francis Dray's kitchen and the solicitor's table, and the letter that had called her unstable, about the oak tree in the garden that she still hadn't let herself look at directly, about a man who had said I should have asked and meant it. "We can't quite start over," she said. "I know you too well already." Something shifted in his face, not the faint possibility she'd seen before. "The real thing, then continue," he said. Whatever we are." She agreed. The estate matter was settled in January. Her uncle did not fight the final order. The house was transferred back to the Holt estate, and Thea, as sole heir under the restored will, received it. The solicitors shook her hand. The documents were signed in a room with a fire, not the cold one from 8 months ago. Lawrence was there. He did not say much. He didn't need to. Afterward, they walked back to the house together through the January cold, and when they came up the front steps, not the servants' entrance, Thea paused at the door. She looked at the garden, at the oak tree her father had planted the year she was born. It was bare in the January frost, its branches dark against a pale sky. She had been afraid, she realized, to look at it directly, as if looking would make too much real at once. She looked at it now. Lawrence waited beside her. He didn't say anything. He seemed to understand that she needed a moment, and he gave it to her without making her ask. "I used to climb it," she said, "when I was small. My mother thought I'd fall. Did you?" "Once." She paused. "Not badly." He was quiet for a moment. "It needs pruning. It always needed pruning. My father never got around to it." She turned from the tree and looked at the house, her house. The stone front, the windows, the old door with the brass handle that her mother had polished every Sunday. Inside, Agnes was visible through the kitchen window, and beyond her cook, and the warm light of the range. "There's still a loose board on the 4th step," she said. "Step left to avoid it." He looked at her. "I've been stepping right. That's why it creaks." "Yes," she said. She opened the door and went inside. He followed. "Some things are taken from you so gradually that by the time you understand what's gone, you can't remember the moment it left. And some things you have to go back for. Through the wrong door, under a borrowed name, carrying a letter your father left in a book-shaped box. Before they're really yours again." Thea had gone back. She had what she came for. And she had found, along the way, something she hadn't been looking for at all.